The sky is lighted with a brightness unknown just a decade ago.
For man now embarks on the greatest adventure in history. He's leaving the confines of his world, and he's reaching out for worlds beyond. So far, two nations, America and Russia, are almost alone in space in this exciting race into the unknown.
Little is known about Russia's Spaceport, which is located near Baikonur, Kazakhstan. All operations are kept secret, and even newsmen rarely get near the place. Perhaps this explains the tremendous interest and participation by people all over the world in Cape Kennedy. Through modern communications, all share in its space events as they happen. They know the suspense of a liftoff. And perhaps what is more meaningful, they share the disappointments along with the great successes. Cape Kennedy was the site for the first space efforts of the United States. And it is from Cape Kennedy that Americans will head for the moon and the planets beyond. This, then, is Spaceport, USA. Cape Kennedy, Part 1.
Cape Kennedy is to space what Kitty Hawk, a small North Carolina village, is to aviation. The Cape, as it's called by most missile engineers and people whose work is connected with this missile launching area, is a triangular-shaped piece of land jutting out into the Atlantic Ocean. Many people visiting for the first time are surprised to discover that this 15,000 acres of land is a peninsula among the many hundreds of islands which splinter the east coast of Florida. The Cape is approximately 10 miles offshore from the Florida mainland. This historical film, taken by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, portrays the development of the space age. Shortly after Columbus discovered America, Spanish sailors moved up the coast of the new continent and named the Cape Canaveral, Spanish for cane or canebrake. At that time, abundant thickets of the brittle hollow reeds grew there. Indians apparently knew the Cape even earlier and made use of it, for archaeologists have found arrowheads, bones, ornaments, and pottery scraps beneath the Cape's sands.
Because the Cape posed a navigational hazard to ships during fog and darkness, in 1847, the federal government established a lighthouse at its tip. Except for serving as a Coast Guard station, little other use was made of the Cape until around 1947. Then it was selected as the ideal site from which long-range guided missiles could be launched and tracked. It was ideal because the area was sparsely populated, and from the tip of the Cape, extending down into the South Atlantic Ocean, there was 5,000 miles of open water. And the many Caribbean islands were ideal for radar and other electronic equipment to track the missiles in flight.
From this beginning, developed the Atlantic Missile Range managed by the U.S. Air Force. The huge missiles now tested at the Cape are quite a contrast to the first missile launched there in 1951. With Russia's first launch in 1957, the space race was on, and missiles began to serve a dual purpose at the Cape. In addition to their military function, missiles would now serve as launch vehicles to boost the scientific and manned satellites of the future.
To handle the non-military space program of the United States, the Space Act of 1958 created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, a civilian agency called NASA.
Firmly committed to space exploration, the United States named its first 7 astronauts in April 1958. Donald K. Slayton, Alan B. Shepard, Walter M. Schirra, Virgil I. Grissom, John H. Glenn, L. Gordon Cooper, and M. Scott Carpenter. These original 7 astronauts became known as the Mercury 7, and they eagerly accepted the challenge of space. And in the piloting ability which these men possessed, the basic objectives of the Mercury program are reflected. These objectives were to place a man in orbit around the world, determine his ability in the space environment, and return him and his spacecraft safely back to Earth.
Man, however, was not the first living thing that the United States sent into space. It was only when the chimpanzee called Ham successfully rode a Mercury capsule atop a Redstone booster that the U.S. felt itself ready to commit a man to space flight. Ham went up, and cameras recorded his unconcern with it all. And when he came down, he found his physical checkup equally boring.
But on May 5th, 1961, when Alan Shepard rode atop a Redstone missile to an altitude of 115 miles to become the first American into space, his attitude was somewhat different.
On the periscope, what a beautiful view.
I bet it is.
I'll cover over Florida, 3 to 4 tenths near the eastern coast, obscures up through Hatteras.
It was just 2.5 months later that Gus Grissom duplicated Shepard's flight. For Cape Canaveral, though, even greater activity was in store than the exciting Mercury program. For the decision to place a man on the moon was reached in 1961. To make possible a lunar launch from the Cape, NASA, with congressional approval, purchased and soon broke ground on 80,000 acres behind and north of the Cape, which NASA had been sharing with the Air Force. No longer a part of the Cape proper, NASA's new land lay on Merritt Island, which lies between the peninsula on which the Cape is located and the Florida mainland. The industrial park, the assembly vehicle area, and new launch stands on the beach now comprise MILA, which stands for Merritt Island Launch Area.
In 1961, however, the moon program was still in the offing. And as John Glenn readied himself for his orbital flight, the Mercury capsule was combined with the Atlas rocket vehicle, and test flights continued. Then, on February 20th, 1962, Glenn's big day arrived. The crowds on nearby Cocoa Beach witnessed firsthand the liftoff, while millions watched tensely on television.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff. Liftoff at 34 minutes after the hour.
As John Glenn moved into orbit, he described his flight to the ears of the world.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous. Roger, has started. Roger, capsule turning around, and I could see the booster during turnaround just a couple of 100 yards behind me. It was beautiful. This is Friendship 7. Can see clear back a big cloud pattern way back across toward the Cape. Beautiful sight.
The view of the world as seen from the Friendship 7 is shown by these time-lapse films taken at 4 frames per second from the Mercury capsule. And on course, Glenn proceeds around and around.
At last, America, along with Russia, had placed a man in orbit around the world. 3 times Glenn circled the globe, and NASA's hopes for the Mercury program were riding as high as Glenn. America's response to Glenn's flight was spontaneous. Some expressions of the feeling of the time may now seem overly sentimental, but in the emotion of that day, Americans loved this adventure, and each expressed his joy in his own way.
New York, of course, expressed its joy in the way it does so well. And a joint session of Congress offered its rostrum. The success of John Glenn lifted hopes at Cape Canaveral as well as across the nation. Still using the Air Force Atlas as a booster, 3 more manned flights were made. By placing cameras aboard, the performance of the missile and the Mercury capsule could be viewed later in detail. Carpenter's flight on May the 24th, 1962, proved that Glenn's orbits around the Earth had not been a random success, while Shiraz on October the 3rd, 1962, was described as an engineering test flight. And then, on May 15th, 1963, Faith 7 lifted off with astronaut Cooper aboard. 34 hours later, Cooper closed the Mercury program by completing a 22-orbit spaceflight. Yet, more than anything else, Cooper demonstrated the advantages of adding man to a space system. His spacecraft short-circuited late in flight, yet all the way down to a precise landing in the Pacific, just several thousand yards from the waiting aircraft carrier recovery ship. He managed to bypass the faulty circuits. He piloted the Faith 7 under the direct and immediate supervision of his own hand. Thus, Cooper's successful descent closed the Mercury program with its 25 flight tests, 6 of which had been manned. With this solid space foundation, the projects Gemini and Apollo could now be carried into action. Once safely aboard the recovery ship, astronaut Cooper emerged from his long flight and showed no adverse effects from his experiences. Once and for all, the Mercury program had established that man can exist safely in space and, while there, perform useful tasks. At the close of the Mercury program, James E. Webb, administrator for NASA, summed up the United States space program. Mr. Webb formerly served as Undersecretary of the Treasury, Director of the Bureau of Budget, and Undersecretary of State.
I think we stand in the position that 1958 actions have been carried forward vigorously and effectively, and we've learned a great deal about how to build and fly equipment in space. We've developed an active space science program to give us information that engineers can use. We've developed the mid-course correction, which we use in Ranger and Mariner. These kinds of things we have developed and proved out and have available to us. We have let the contracts to American industry to build the really big boosters that are intended to give us preeminence in space, particularly in manned space flight. And I think we are in the process of passing the Russians with respect to large spacecraft and large boosters, but I think you can only say that they are ahead of us now and will be in weightlifting capacity for some time to come.
At Cape Canaveral, the recording optical tracking instrument with its telescope, coupled with a 70-millimeter camera, captures the missile action at very long ranges. And by looking into the future at Cape Canaveral, the Saturn missile begins to take shape. In eerie space, the inner workings of a Saturn missile come to life. This, in time, after many tests and developments, will become the big Saturn V to stand on its launch pad, hopefully before 1970, and carry 3 men into space, 2 of whom will leave the Apollo capsule and head for the moon. To the 80% of Americans who've never been in an airplane, such a thought may seem like a fantasy. But the technological wonders of the 20th century are being dwarfed in this space decade, just as the Earth itself is being dwarfed, as man extends himself into the universe.
But the well-organized space program of the United States does not revolve completely around man's active participation. The orbiting solar observatory, designed to study the sun during the course of one full solar cycle, is just one example of the many unmanned satellites which come to the Cape for launching. Many of these are cooperative programs in space research which NASA conducts with over 60 nations throughout the world. SYNCOM, the forerunner of Early Bird, typifies the applications of spacecraft as communications vehicles. Similar applications in weather, navigation, and geodetic vehicles have also demonstrated that man can use space to his advantage in many ways.
In addition to active communication satellites such as Early Bird, there are also passive satellites such as ECHO. This early experimental ECHO shows how the balloon inflates when launched. The skin of the balloon reflects and scatters all radio signals beamed at it. ECHO 2, with its 135-foot diameter balloon, was launched on January the 25th, 1964, and was destined to be used in the first series of cooperative space activities between the United States and Russia. In quantity, satellites such as ECHO and Early Bird may require the first space laws to regulate the communications explosion.
In the realm of lunar and deep space satellites, the U.S. has payloads such as this Ranger 7 and the Mariner Mars.
Yet man remains the dominant figure in the total space picture, and his struggle to conquer the space environment continues. In a human centrifuge, he whirls and whirls, and his simulation of space travel becomes almost a science in itself. But the greatest problem in space is weightlessness. How can man perform in zero gravity? To test this, there can be no simulation. The Gemini astronauts get prepared for the weightlessness they will experience in their trip to the moon by maneuvering inside an airplane which is flying a parabolic path. The rigors of space training require a discipline which man has never before endured. The challenges of space intrigue all, but they require the particular attention of the President of the United States.
In the fall of 1963 at Cape Canaveral, preparations were underway full speed on the Gemini Apollo moon program. And shortly, President Kennedy was due to arrive for a briefing.
How do you string power lines across wooded hills with a minimum of tree cutting? PG&E's answer is the helicopter. In some cases, concrete and steel for transmission towers are flown in by air. After the towers are erected, 2 PG&E linemen are landed on top. Here come 300 pounds of insulators. While one man directs traffic, the other attaches the insulator string, then they leapfrog to the next tower. Power line stringing starts when the copter pulls a lead cable from tower to tower. The whole job is done in half the time a ground crew would need. Every step is planned to ensure a minimum of tree trimming and to preserve the natural beauty. And so it goes until the job is done and the new power line is ready to serve California growth. Another example of how PG&E uses the most modern techniques, saving time, cutting costs, to provide abundant, dependable, low-cost power.
It was at Cape Canaveral on November the 19th, 1963, that President Kennedy began his fateful tour that was later to take him to Texas.
The Moon Project, which now occupied the attention here at the Cape, had begun under President Eisenhower as a study in flying a manned spacecraft around the moon. But the idea of actually landing a man on the moon by 1970 was of vital interest to President Kennedy, along with every other aspect of the space program.
From this briefing at the Cape by James E. Webb and Werner von Braun, director of Marshall Space Flight Center, President Kennedy went on to Houston, where he described his visit to the Cape in a memorable speech at Rice University.
The exploration of space will go ahead, whether we join in it or not. And it is one of the great adventures of all time. And no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space. Those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the Industrial Revolution, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. It is for these reasons that I regard the decision last year to shift our efforts in space from low to high gear as among the most important decisions that will be made during my incumbency in the office of the presidency. In the last 24 hours, we have seen facilities now being created for the greatest and most complex exploration in man's history. We have felt the ground shake and the air shattered by the testing of a Saturn C-1 booster rocket, many times as powerful as the Atlas which launched John Glenn, generating power equivalent to 10,000 automobiles with their accelerator on the floor. We have seen the site where 5 F-1 rocket engines, each one as powerful as all 8 engines of the Saturn combined, will be clustered together to make the advanced Saturn missile.
In a matter of weeks after President Kennedy's last visit to the Cape, Spaceport, USA bore his name. On our next program, Cape Kennedy, Part 2.